Hello Internet, my name is the Golden Stalfos, and today we're going to continue our series where we review every single Zelda game. And today we're all the way up to number 4, A Link to the sorry, that was last week. A Link's Awakening. That one. Link's Awakening. Which I mentioned in the previous video is by far the best 2D Zelda game. And the reasons why have largely to do with the mechanics and the design of dungeons, which are two things I didn't really mention very much in my previous videos because up until this point they've been very bare bones, right? Most of the puzzles in dungeons are kill all the enemies in the room, push the blocks so they make the correct shape. Use the one item that comes in this dungeon to do the one obvious thing that it does. And that's about it. And honestly, that's fine. Most of the games in the franchise have puzzles on that level, and that's a fine base level to start with your puzzles. But if you want recognition, you have to go a little bit beyond that, right? And the same thing goes with combat and movement, right? Like most of the games, you can walk in multiple directions, you can attack forward, and that's it. When we get to 3D, we introduce lock on, and there's a few things that you can do with that. But for the most part, you just walk around and you attack and you use whatever item is equipped. And it's interesting that the game which takes this to the highest level of complexity, at least in the 2D space, is the game that was the most limited in that regard. Because, it was made for a Game Boy and thus only has 2 buttons and a D-pad, and that's it. There's a pause button, for if you want to pause and see the menu and shit, but that's it. That's all you have to work with. There's no shoulder buttons, there's no X and Y. A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo had so many more buttons than Game Boy Advance. Like 6 extra buttons. And, 5. But A Link to the Past had so much more options for movement, so much more options for control, and yet its combat, its mechanics are not as complex as those of Link's Awakening. See, the way it works is, in Link's Awakening, every single thing that you can use can be equipped to either A or B. That includes your shield and your sword and all of your dungeon items and any important items you get in the overworld. All your bombs, your magic powder, your arrows, everything is equipped to either A or B. And they increase the complexity further by adding multiple items that just didn't really exist prior to this game. The Rock's Feather was first in this game, and so are the Phoenix Boots, which are both really useful items for traversing the world and also interacting with puzzles. And because of these items, they can make the game design, the layout of the levels, the way you interact with the world, vastly more complex than what has been seen in any previous game, and honestly more complex than what's seen in a lot of later games. Now, I won't say that the complexity isn't outmatched by things like Oracle of Ages, right? But it's worth noting that that game, while it is more complex, is less good overall because, well, because the complexities of that development cycle. The Oracle games were meant to be like each 1/3 of the Triforce, and so they each focus on one thing to the exclusion of several other things. And because of that, while each game is good and really excels in the area they tried to focus on, none of them is like as cohesive or as good on the whole as a Link's Awakening, you know? Even though they use the same base system of using items, it because Link's Awakening was trying to be a complete game and the Oracle games were trying to be pieces of a game, Link's Awakening feels more complete and thus better. But I will admit that the high points in those games do often exceed the high points in this game. But yeah, the mechanical depth here is significantly higher than before. And not only are you able to change the way you play the game completely by, switching which items you have equipped, but also you can make item combinations which change the way you interact with the world, right? You can use the Roc's Feather and the Pegasus Boots together to sprint and jump over large gaps, which is really, really awesome. And it really changes the way that you interact with the environment. Again, having this complex interaction of items allows the game developers to build the map more complexly. Now, instead of just having one square gaps that the Pegasus or that the Roc's Feather can cross on its own, now they can have multiple squares as gaps that you need both items to get across. And similarly, you can combine the Pegasus Boots with the sword to do damage as you sprint. I mean, you normally do damage when you sprint, but you do a different animation when you're holding up the sword and sprinting. Because the shield is an item that you can't always have equipped, they were able to design enemies around that, right? Like, if they went with the Zelda 1 system of as long as you're facing the opponent, you're holding your shield, right? I mean, that game has the same number of buttons available, but the system they went with is much less complex, right? In that system, you couldn't have the turtles, right? Because then the only way you would, the way to defeat the turtles is just to look at them as they attack you, which isn't, that isn't gameplay, right? So instead, they made the shield a detachable item so that you can mix and match items. And they made the sword a detachable item. So you can have scenarios where you don't even have the sword equipped, right? You can have scenarios where you don't have the shield equipped. And they can make enemies that are built to be bested with different items than the sword and shield, which increases the complexity of combat, right? If you've gone through most of the game with the bow and the sword, and then you come into a room where you need to equip the shield to deal with the turtles, right? That is a gameplay decision, right? You have to think about it and then do it, and it adds complexity over just having the shield on you all the time, right? And they really take advantage of this. If you want to play Link's Awakening, my suggestion would be to play Link's Awakening DX for the Game Boy Color. Emulate it if you don't have a Game Boy Color. It's fine. I would not recommend buying the shitty remake because it's a shitty remake, just like all of the Zelda remakes. None of them have been good. They are all just rushed out third party crap that looks like crap, plays like crap, has no new content, no new gameplay, nothing added. Bullshit. Don't buy them. The remakes are shit. uh, if you're going to charge people $40 for a game they already own or have owned in the past, then you need to offer a little more than a graphical update or, one interesting item that's optional and off to the side and doesn't actually change much about the game. Like that's just shitty business practices. But then again, it's Nintendo, so shitty business practices are like their thing. At least nowadays. So, if you want to play the game, I'd recommend you play the director's cut for the Game Boy Color. It comes with an extra dungeon. This dungeon isn't as complex or interesting as many of the other ones throughout the game, because it's mostly just there to test that you can in fact see the colors, because they wanted people to play it on Game Boy Color instead of on the original. Which is also kind of shitty business practices, come to think of it, but whatever. The reward for this dungeon is pretty cool, and it either lets you increase your strength or your defense, which is nice. And other than that, it's just a neat little thing to go through. But the game is obviously much prettier with the full colors, and there's music for this game, which is great. Quite frankly, Zelda games having great music has always been a thing, right? Even back in Zelda 1 when there was one track, it was a really good track. In Zelda 2, they were similarly restricted in the amount of music they could have, but it was still really good music. And being a Game Boy game, this game also, a Game Boy original, this game is also pretty limited in the amount of music, but it is all high quality, so the music isn't necessarily the game's strongest point when you compare it to, say, A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past definitely had more music tracks and more interesting things going on with the music because it's on a bigger platform with bigger cartridges that can allow for that. But yeah, the Link's Awakening does a pretty good job with its music. The dungeons, as I mentioned earlier, are more complex than before because the tools available are more complex and the way you use them is more complex. And, in Link's Awakening, it's not unusual to go through a dungeon and have branching pathways and have to ask yourself, okay, do I use my key here or here? It's not uncommon to run into scenarios where you have multiple keys without having encountered a locked door yet, and oh crap, there's going to be branching pathways up ahead, and I'm going to have to explore in 4 different directions. And that's always true. The levels, the dungeons always sprawl out in as many different directions as possible, and the overall path through them is much more complex and interesting than any previous games. Whenever you reach the halfway point of the dungeon on the intended main route, you hit a checkpoint that will warp you back to the beginning of the dungeon, and vice versa. So you can quickly get back to that halfway point If you, say, die fighting the final boss and have to go back to the beginning of the dungeon, you know. This also helps with exploring different paths and backtracking, so it's a really good system. And as far as the kinds of items you get to use in this game, they're fairly unique. As mentioned before, the Pegasus boots and rock feather are new in this game. There's also a shovel, which can help you dig for buried treasure at various points throughout the game, which is very interesting. Um, there's oh, there's the hammer. There's obviously a sword and shield, arrows. The you know, like there's a lot of unique things going on here as far as the way you interact with the world. It doesn't get quite as interesting as like the Oracle games where you have that slingshot that can ricochet and stuff, you know. But again, this game is better on the whole. It's tighter and more concise and more complete as a game experience. There's also the narrative elements. Obviously, you know, Zelda isn't known for its complex narratives, but this one actually has a pretty interesting message about, like what it means to be alive and whether or not any of the stuff you do in the game is real and whether or not it matters that it's real. And yeah, it gets kind of deep because, spoiler alert, it was all a dream. But you kind of know that the whole time. Like, the more you play through the game, the more obvious it becomes that this whole thing is just Link's crazed dream. And when you wake the windfish, that will make Link wake up and the whole world here will disappear. And it's really interesting because, like, you know, in winning, you lose. If you don't finish the game, then these people continue to exist and go on. But if you don't finish the game, Link never wakes up and the world outside is doomed. And yeah, it's weird, you know? Also, I think they went a lot further into giving characters personality to try and drive that home. Um, there were some interesting characters to talk to in Link to the Past, but they definitely crank that up here. Like, I don't think there are any characters in A Link to the Past that are as quirky and memorable as, like, Malon and, like, you know? And because characters like that are all over, and because quests involving those characters are all over, it just feels like a much more vibrant and living world, you know? And also, while we're talking about that, let's talk about side quests. This game has a bunch of them, and they're really interesting. And the biggest one is actually a whole bunch of them strung together, is the trading quest. Um, this is where it started, right? And so basically, you trade items back and forth. At one point, you escort a chain chomp around the map. Um, and several of the items you have to trade back and forth are like critical to your actual progression through the story, right? Like, there's this one area with a bridge where you have to interact with some monkeys, and in order to get them to, move on and complete the actual story quest here, you have to do part of the trading mission, which is really interesting. So basically, by the time you complete the game, you'll almost certainly have done several parts of the trading mission, if not all of it. Um, Sorry, people were yelling outside. What was I saying? Right, the trading mission is good, and it's fun. There's lots of quirky moments with quirky characters along the way. The items you trade for are really unique and interesting, and at the end you get something very useful out of it. I won't spoil. Uh, but yeah, it's definitely worthwhile to play this game and experience the mechanics, the complexity, the depth of the level design. Like, this game, I didn't play this game until high school when I went back and played through all of the Zelda games. Like, up until that point, I had only played like 5 or so of the most recent titles. Like, I started with Four Swords Adventures and Twilight Princess and Wind Waker, and that basically everything since then, from when Four Swords Adventures came out to when I was in high school, I had played. But then I was like, I should play everything. So I went back and played everything, not in order. And this game made a huge impression on me. It's so well done. It's so crisp and smooth, and there's not a single bit of it that's wasted. Like, the main reason that something like Oracle of Ages or Oracle of Seasons isn't seen as better than this game is because those games have, well, one, they have a focus, so the things they aren't focused on aren't as tight. But two, they have long stretches of the game where you're just bored out of your skull, walking from one end of the map to the other to try and unlock the next dungeon. And this doesn't happen in Link's Awakening, right? Because it's a Game Boy game. The map size is much smaller than a Game Boy Advance title can have, and because of that, they make use of everything. Every last inch of the map is properly utilized to bring out the best play experience and expose you to the largest amount of the world. And it's great. It's compact, and that leads to a tight gameplay experience. Honestly, when people ask me what my favorite Zelda game is, I usually say Twilight Princess, because it's the best 3D Zelda by a mile, and I have the fondest memories with it. But, like, this is really close. Like, in terms of gameplay, this is the best that we've gotten so far. Now, again, that's as a complete experience. Obviously, there are individual moments in the Oracle games that exceed this, and there are certain sections in certain games that are very nice, but as a whole, nothing is as well built and as tight and as fun as a Link's Awakening. And yeah, I love it. I love it so much. Also, this game is completely linear. Well, sort of. There's no actual rule that says you have to go through the dungeons in a specific order. However, you do have to get the correct items to explore the map to get to the correct dungeon. And you get those items in a specific order through the specific dungeons. So it's effectively linear. If you could warp past the roadblocks then you could go through the dungeons in any order. But there are roadblocks, so it is linear. And, you know, I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Like, a lot of people get upset at games when they're linear nowadays, but I don't think that's a problem. I just think that it kind of shows that a well constructed experience is a well constructed experience, whether it's open ended or not. And if it's constructed well enough, it will be a good experience, whether it's open or not. And if it's not constructed very well, it'll be a boring, shitty experience. And also, when a game wants to tell a specific narrative, like this game does, linearity is very useful for that. So, I don't hold that against them at all. And in fact, I think the game is brought to new heights because the developers knew exactly what order you're going to do things in, and so they can make each section perfect as it builds off of the previous section, and because of this consistent rate of progression, because the game is so tightly built, you feel the experience they wanted you to feel, and it's so well made. So yeah, I have nothing but praise for Link's Awakening, and the only thing I really wish is that the remake had been handled with any level of care. I wish it had been handled by Nintendo specifically, and of course, it couldn't have been handled by the original team who created the game because, well, some of them are dead, some of them don't work at Nintendo anymore. It would take a larger team no matter what, so there'd be new people anyway. But still, it's great. And I wish the remake had been handled better. As it is, it's a passable remake, It doesn't really add anything or do anything new, but it's there. It exists. It's whatever. Yeah, that's everything. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next life. Laters. Okay, end card time. I'm supposed to tell you to like, comment, subscribe, all that stupid YouTube shit. There's a bell thingy, whatever. I have all the social media stuff: Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube. Mostly I use Facebook and Twitter to tell you about my Twitch and YouTube uploads. I've got a Patreon, but Patreon is one of those things where people who can afford to throw away money give money to people who can't. And so if you can't afford to throw away money, then you shouldn't be doing that. And if you can afford to throw away money, consider charities. There's a pandemic, there's global warming, there's millions of people in the world who don't have toilets, which is just awful. So I've linked a few charities in the description down below in case you're interested in that. And if you can't donate money to a charity, consider donating some of your time, because that's also very useful. And yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.